On behalf of the National Press Club's Freedom of the Press Committee, I would like to thank you all for coming out during Sunshine Week for what I hope will be an illuminating and thoughtful discussion on what many press freedom advocates believe is an increasingly serious threat to the ability of journalists everywhere to report frankly on government policy without fear of coming under harassment or imprisonment. My name is Rachel Oswald, and I will be your moderator tonight. First, I want to give a plug for Sunshine Week at the Press Club. On Friday, we have a luncheon scheduled for 12:30 where our speaker will be Thomas Drake. He's a whistleblower for the NSA who was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Tickets are $17 and can be purchased at press.org. According to a report issued last year by Human Rights Watch, in the years since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, over 140 foreign governments have passed anti-terror laws that have increasingly been used to threaten the ability of journalists everywhere. Human Rights Watch states that, quote, these post-September 11 laws, when viewed as a whole, represent a broad and dangerous expansion of government powers to investigate, arrest, detain, and prosecute individuals at the expense of due process, judicial oversight, and public transparency, end quote. In 2012, a record number of 231 journalists were in prison, according to an investigation by the Committee to Protect Journalists. Of that number, at least 132 journalists were jailed on anti-state charges such as treason, terrorism, and subversion. Currently, U.S. NATO ally Turkey leads all nations in imprisoning journalists, it leads in China and Iran in the incarceration of journalists, with approximately 40 reporters behind bars. Other standouts in this category include Ethiopia, Eritrea, Yemen, and Vietnam. But it is the United States who largely led the way and set the example for using anti-terror laws and national security concerns to stifle the voice of journalism. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that in the last decade, the U.S. has jailed a minimum of 14 journalists in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Guantanamo Bay. Most were officially never charged, but were broadly alleged by U.S. officials to have committed terror-related crimes or security violations. These allegations have not been backed up by the U.S. government, CPJ has concluded. There has also been a disturbing push domestically to crack down on coverage of U.S. counterterrorism policies. President Obama has personally intervened to keep a well-known Yemeni journalist behind bars. Abdullah Haider Shaya in 2009 reported with evidence that a U.S. airstrike killed 14 women and 21 children in Yemen. Shaya was arrested in 2010 on terrorism charges, but after coming under considerable pressure by then-President Saleh, under considerable pressure, President Saleh was about to issue a pardon when in February 2011, President Obama spoke with him directly on the phone and requested that Shaya remain in prison due to his reported, quote, association with al-Qaeda. Shaya is understood to remain behind bars where he has served more than 2 years of a 5-year sentence. Commenting on the issue in an editorial, The Nation magazine said, quote, while paying lip service to media freedom, this administration has undermined the rights of journalists and the whistleblowers who aid them, whose work has sometimes cast the government in a negative light, end quote. Our distinguished panel tonight will discuss how anti-terror laws are being used by some governments to suppress reporting they do not like. We will first hear from Frank Januzzi, who serves as Executive Director of as Deputy Executive Director of Amnesty International USA, and as the head of their D.C. office. He previously served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under our now Secretary of State, John Kerry, where he was a policy director for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. After Frank, we will hear from Mohammed Keita, who is the Committee to Protect Journalists Africa Advocacy Coordinator. Before joining CPJ, Keita volunteered as a researcher for the non-governmental World Federalist Movement Institute of Global Policy, which works to build international democratic institutions. Keita has also done human rights outreach work in West Africa on behalf of the United Nations. Finally, we will hear from Mark Feldstein, a professor of broadcast journalism at the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism. In his 2 decades spent as an investigative correspondent for ABC, CNN, and other outlets, Feldstein has been roughed up in the United States, detained and censored by authorities in Egypt, and escorted out of Haiti by armed guards. Feldstein's 2010 book is Poisoning the Press, Richard Nixon, Jack Anderson, and the Rise of Washington Scandal Culture. I should note that the Press Club did invite the State Department to send representative to share the Obama administration's views on our panel topic tonight, but they ultimately were unable to provide us with a speaker. Our format tonight will begin with remarks from each of our three panelists. I will ask that each panelist keep the remarks to no more than 15 minutes. I will then follow up with a few opening questions to the panel, and after that, we will turn it over to you, the audience, for what I anticipate will be an engaging, thought-provoking, and challenging debate.
Thank you, Rachel. And it falls to me really just to give you the scene setter this evening. And because Rachel has done an admirable job of already covering some of the landscape, I will try to be very brief and allow time for the other panelists who are more expert than I am on the matter to address it more fully and to share some of their thoughts. But this topic is one that is very near and dear to me. I began my professional life as a journalist, writing for the Daily Texan in Austin, Texas. And at the time, it was my first paying job. And it was so exciting for me to make $3.95 an hour and to write about issues like the University of Texas land grabs in East Austin to try to expand their campus. And I even experienced, in a very small way, not the arrest or intimidation that Mark has experienced, or the indefinite detention, arrest, and torture and trial of journalists around the world as part of a crackdown on counterterrorism. But I did witness the power of the state to stifle, intimidate, and otherwise attempt to silence critics. And so it is a subject that I feel a strong personal attachment to. And now that I've joined Amnesty International after 23 years of working on the forces of evil on Capitol Hill and the State Department, I feel liberated to share with you some of my concerns tonight. So this subject, freedom of the press in a time of heightened national security, international security, and this paroxysm of movements around the world by states to put limits on journalists in the interest of security. It's not a new tension. It's not a new phenomenon. In times of warfare and conflict, the first victim, other than truth, is the ability of people to speak the truth and to publish the truth, especially if it's an unwelcome truth or critical thoughts. And I was on Capitol Hill on 9/11, and I sat literally on a gutter with Senator Biden for about 2 hours after the attack. Our cell phones wouldn't work, and we were sitting there wondering how the world was about to change. And the thing that I didn't imagine at the time was the extent to which my own government, through the laws it would enact following 9/11, would contribute to a climate of fear and repression around the world that would empower governments in China or Ethiopia or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Israel or Yemen or Venezuela or China to enact laws in the interest of national security, which would enable them to do the kinds of things that they would love to have been able to do anyway for other reasons, just to stifle critics. I don't think it was the intention of the United States in the passing of their post-9/11 laws to give such latitude to governments that were not constrained by a First Amendment, but it has been one of the unfortunate side effects. Now, I love a book I can recommend to all of you, Anthony Lewis's biography of the First Amendment, Freedom for the Thought We Hate. The book chronicles the evolution of the protections that are enjoyed or were enjoyed until very recently by U.S. journalists that are somewhat unique around the world, protections that are found in the First Amendment but which were in fact grown over the course of time through court cases to enable those rights to flourish and find full voice. And I think one of the central points of Anthony Lewis's work is that because those rights that so many Americans take for granted are the product of an evolution of judicial activism and judicial interpretation of the Constitution, they're reversible. We shouldn't think that the First Amendment, as it's understood in 2013, is the First Amendment that we were handed 200 years ago when the Bill of Rights were enacted into law. And in fact, I think we're witnessing an assault on many of those First Amendment rights right now. Now, as Rachel pointed out, the Committee to Protect Journalists has noted that the United States itself in the last 10 years has arrested at least 14 journalists in Afghanistan, Iraq, and put some of them in Guantanamo Bay indefinitely without charge. And this prosecution of those loosely affiliated in some way, often in a very tangential way, with terrorist organizations or terrorist movements around the world, the use of national security laws to imprison these journalists sets a really chilling example to the rest of the world, when in fact the United States should be setting the opposite example, the example of maximum protection for freedom of speech, maximum space for those who want to report about the world around them, maximum protection for their freedom of speech. There's one particular case that Amnesty has campaigned on, the case of Sami al-Hajj at Guantanamo. He was a cameraman for Al Jazeera, spent 5 years, I think, several years in prison without charge, eventually released, but only after enormous international pressure brought to bear, not just by Amnesty, but by like-minded civil society organizations around the world. Imagine yourself as that journalist, attempting to report on the national security challenges around you, the terrorism around you, and being arrested and wrapped up as a co-conspirator because you're trying to do your job as a journalist. And don't think that it couldn't happen to you, I think, is the message of this arrest. Now, is the United States uniquely responsible for this crackdown on press freedom? I think it would be absurd to suggest that. At the same time, the responsibility that rests on the U.S. shoulders as a global example, as the only nation that does have a First Amendment, to me is somewhat profound. All states may have an equal responsibility to ensure freedom of expression, but the United States has a unique capacity to, by its example, help to propagate those values and to help protect them in countries that are not inclined just by their laws or by their culture or by their political history to protect them. So it's a very real and serious problem that we face, this tension between promoting freedom of expression and finding the appropriate bounds for security to make the world a safer place. But it shouldn't be, in fact, an either-or question of liberty and security. I mean, the best way for the United States and other countries to ensure their liberty, to ensure their security is, in fact, through the promotion of human rights and maximizing human liberty. And violations of human rights are not going to contribute to our security. Let me touch on, briefly, on a couple of examples around the world, and then I know Mohammed is going to also take us on a kaleidoscopic but brief journey around the world to point out some of the concrete examples of what we're talking about in terms of the ways in which new laws around the world are constraining press freedom. So look at a country like Ecuador. The Committee to Protect Journalists has investigated the shutting down of 11 different radio stations in Ecuador, and they've found that many of those were ones that, not surprisingly, were criticizing the government, and they were shut down as a response to their criticism. And Ecuador is also working within the OAS system to undermine that organization, that regional organization's commitment to press freedoms, to water down the commitments. Look at country Kuwait, a U.S. ally, U.S. treaty ally. The Press and Publications Law, which was revised in 2006, prohibits the publication of material that insults God or the prophets or Islam. It also forbids criticism of the emir. Now, I was pleased to host Aung San Suu Kyi at the museum last September 21st. And some of my young Amnesty members put a question to her about the Russian punk rock band Pussy Riot. And they said, now, Da Suu, do you agree that this Russian band should not be imprisoned for what they did in Russia. And it was very interesting. Dasu was not eager to jump to their defense. She said, well, it depends, she said. Did they insult someone? And my boss, Suzanne Nossel, had to admit, well, yes, they did. They were quite insulting. Well, who did they insult? She asked. Well, they insulted President Putin. And then she laughed. She said, oh, that's different. Leaders of the country need to understand that their position comes with criticism. And especially in this time of heightened attention to security and the attempts by states around the world to use these laws to stifle criticism of leadership in the name of promoting security and stability. A law that forbids criticism of the emir in Kuwait is not one that the United States should be silent about. We should be criticizing such laws, but we don't any more than we do in the state of Bahrain because we have other strategic interests at stake, all right? And you've all heard that trade-off. From where I sit in Amnesty, that is a very short-term approach to advancing U.S. national security interests in the Middle East. Standing with emirs and sultans who stifle dissent is a formula for those governments to be destabilized over time rather than a formula for them to remain as potentially very valuable and fruitful U.S. friends and partners in the region. I just got back from Vietnam. It was the first time that Amnesty has been to Vietnam in about 24 years. And it was a very fruitful visit. And I was very glad to be there. But I was also very candid with them when I was there. And we talked about the fact that Vietnam is another country that uses national security laws to arrest bloggers for their criticism of the government or for their zealousness to put out an anti-China line that goes farther than what the government feels comfortable with. You have countries across the political spectrum, from democracies to sultanates to one-party states, all of them following a U.S. example, which is not the example maybe that the United States ought to be setting. And let me turn finally to Africa and Ethiopia, because I know that Mohammed is going to speak about Africa, and hopefully this will provide a seamless segue to his presentation to you about the assault on press freedoms around the world, but a particular Amnesty prisoner of conscience, Eskander Nega. Now, Eskander and opposition party leader Andualem Aregi, am I pronouncing? Aregi. I speak Chinese, but I'm not as good with the African names yet. I need to work. They were arrested and detained in 2011 because of their criticism of the government. We care so much about these cases because it is the journalists who are on the front line of trying to inform their body politics about what's happening both in their own countries and around the world. And when you silence the architects of speech, when you silence those who are themselves the foundation stones of civil society and an informed public, then you're stifling not only them, but you're sort of impoverishing the whole body politic of a country. And again, this is a U.S. ally, right? A U.S. ally in the war on terrorism, a country upon whom the United States is relying for military forces in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, in Mogadishu. And because of that reliance, the U.S. government has been reluctant to call the Ethiopian government to account for these violations of basic human rights. So I guess the message from Amnesty International this evening is that these assaults on press freedoms are escalating, that the United States government bears, if not a special responsibility for the assault, it has a almost unique ability to set a different example And we would call upon the U.S. government to do that, to criticize not just U.S. adversaries when it's convenient to do so for their repression of freedom of speech or freedom of the press, but to also hold U.S. allies to the same standard, because there's no one standard for the global press freedoms. There is a universal norm at stake here, and it is one that has been hard advanced by the efforts of very courageous journalists like Shurtao in China, now serving part of a 10-year sentence for daring to share with the Chinese people internal deliberations of his own government, which were considered to be secrets by the state. It's incumbent upon the United States to stand with those human rights defenders and to set a very positive example that their rights should not be infringed. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Good evening. I'm very honored to be on such a distinguished panel. Originally, I was just going to focus on Africa, which is my area of deep expertise, and I was going to talk a lot about Ethiopia, but I thought it would be more instructive to actually leave you with faces and names of journalists around the world who have been impacted by this very disturbing trend, so that you also get a sense about the scale and the gravity of this problem. And a lot already has been said that I won't repeat, but I'm a visual person, so I will use images and just talk about images. So as was said, after 9/11, there was a lot of political pressure coming from Washington, especially the Bush administration. As some of you may recall, the former Attorney General John Ashcroft at some point did say that it wasn't patriotic to criticize the actions of the US government in the war on terror because it would only, quote, aid terrorists, end of quote. We also had Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, actually, Condoleezza Rice at the time, who was advising media not to air videos of Osama bin Laden because those videos could contain coded messages. So this pressure out of Washington obviously led to a lot of self-censorship, a lot of censorship for US media, but also outwardly to the world. The United States as well began these detentions of journalists, indefinite detention of journalists who were held for months or even years on charges that were never substantiated. They were arrested on and essentially accused based on circumstance and hearsay. I think the case of Sami Al-Hajj was mentioned earlier. He's a cameraman working for Al Jazeera who was covering the war in Afghanistan and was picked up and detained for 6 years without charge. He was taken to Guantanamo Bay and released after 6 long years. There were also others in Iraq and other places where the US military was involved. And to this day, the US military has not provided any explanation, has not been held to account for these detentions, which set the wrong example around the world and undermine the work of human rights organizations and others, anybody that was fighting for freedom and justice around the world. When talking to governments, the US was setting a very bad standard. The political pressure was also applied at the UN, where the UN Security Council issued a couple of resolutions that were encouraging member states to take all necessary measures to enact tough anti-terrorism laws and to prevent the incitement of terrorism. The problem with those resolutions was that they lacked any form of guidance. So member states had tremendous leeway in enacting anti-terrorism laws as it fitted their purposes. So this led to what we documented at the Committee to Protect Journalists, a spike in the worldwide imprisonment of journalists over the last decade since 9/11. Since 2001, the number of journalists detained around the world has not been below 120. And as you can see, the trend is getting worse and worse. Last year in 2012 was a record year, in large part due to Turkey. And an even more alarming statistic, 57% of those imprisoned were held on anti-state charges, including terrorism. Turkey is the world's biggest offender. It's consistently using terrorism and anti-state charges against journalists. And for Turkey, the government likes to link journalists to anti-state or terrorist groups, opposition groups that are designated as terrorist organizations. A lot of these journalists work for pro-Kurdish media, and they are sometimes held for months or years without charge as investigations are pending. Here we have the case of Özlem Agus. She was arrested in March 2012. She works for a pro-Kurdish Turkish news agency. She had reported on a story about a number of minors who had allegedly been sexually abused in a prison in Turkey. A lot of these children were Kurdish. She was picked up with a number of Kurdish politicians. She was detained for nearly a year, and she's been charged with belonging to a anti-state or terrorist organization, which is the Union of Communities in Kurdistan, which is sort of like it's designated by the Turkish government as a terror group. And she was released recently on bail, but according to her lawyer, she could face up to 22 years in prison. Turkey, of course, holds the world's record, but the long hand of the Turkish government has extended abroad as well. We have the case of Raj TV, which is based in Denmark. It's a pro-Kurdish TV station. It's been established since 2004. And the Turkish embassy in Copenhagen, beginning in 2005, attempted to shut down this station using various lawsuits. And finally, in 2012, the case finally, a criminal complaint was filed against Roj TV for essentially on the accusation of promoting views of the PKK. And the Turkish embassy also asked the Danish media regulators to revoke the license of Roj TV. The regulators ruled that even though the coverage of Roj TV was one-sided, that this station did not advocate or oppose the views of the PKK. Even though it reported the views of the PKK, it did not advocate action, or it did not advocate for violence. So the regulators refused to revoke the license of the station. But in January 2012, a judge imposed a fine of nearly $1 million on Roj TV, convicting the station of disseminating PKK messages. Now, the judge did not shut down Roj TV, and the defense argued that the judgment was based on 0.003% of Roj content, that the prosecutor had basically selected the content that was used for the ruling. And the assumption of the court ruling was that Roj TV would be able to cover impartially and in a balanced way the Kurdish issues. And of course, this is an assumption that does not consider the difficulty of reporting for journalists in Turkey. We have had instances where top Turkish officials have refused to participate in press conferences unless a pro-PKK journalist was taken out of the room. So even access to officials in Turkey is tricky. And in this case, there's a speculation that there might have been a political quid pro quo between Turkey and Denmark, because the current Secretary General of NATO is Denmark's former prime minister, and when he was running to become the one of the nominees, a candidate to be Secretary General of NATO, there has been speculation that Turkey may have conditioned its support of his candidacy in exchange for the shutdown of the station. Now, Mr. Rasmussen has denied these allegations, but it's an interesting idea. I'll move on to US-backed Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is, as was said earlier, a major US counterterrorism partner in the Horn of Africa. And it's a government that has been deepening its ties with China, especially the Chinese Communist Party. And it's the country that leads Africa in censoring the internet. And prisons are filled with dissidents and journalists, just like China. And the ruling party has become more assertive in becoming authoritarian and defiant as well. Nevertheless, the U.S. is still strongly supporting the regime in Addis Ababa for stability. Now, Ethiopia, under the longtime leader Meles Zenawi, passed this anti-terrorism legislation in 2009 that criminalized reporting on banned opposition groups, including the U.S.-based Ginbat Sabat, which is headed by a professor teaching here in Pennsylvania, and two rebel groups fighting the government. So basically, if you're a reporter in Ethiopia and you want to cover, say, a rebel attack on a government position, even the simple action of quoting a statement from one of these groups as a way to balance your report, if you're reporting the government side, you're reporting the rebel side, even quoting a statement from one of these groups is interpreted as lending support to terrorism and carries a prison sentence of up to 20 years in prison. Now, since 2011, 11 journalists have been sentenced based on very vague and broad terror charges. What you're looking at is actually screen grabs from the longtime leader Meles Zenawi's speech in parliament, at which he railed against critics and critical journalists and stated in very explicit terms that critical journalists were terror accomplices. The government has been talking a lot about this very vague terrorist plot, this nebulous plot against the country, and anybody that is a dissident is perceived to be a potential terrorist. So some of these journalists are based in the US or are reporting from abroad into Ethiopia, and they have all been sentenced to very serious prison terms. Two of the most emblematic cases are Eskinder Nega to the left, his case was mentioned earlier, and Riyad Alemu, 31 years old, a columnist, very outspoken columnist. We had a chance to review the court papers in both cases, and the evidence presented by the prosecutors is pathetic and laughable. In the case of Riyad, just to give you an example, they printed an email from her email account because she belonged to this opposition listserv, and this opposition listserv is connected to one of these banned groups. And the prosecutor attempted to assert that by receiving these emails, she was part of a terror network. And another piece of evidence was a photo that she took of an anti-government graffiti in Ethiopia, in the capital, that she emailed to her editor, who's based in Washington here. And the prosecutor again asserted that this is evidence that she is part of a terror network. We also have the cases of two Swedish reporters who attempted to get into eastern Ethiopia, a region that is the home of a counterinsurgency and a region that the government bans access, international media access to, and they were also sentenced for embedding with insurgents. Bahrain is another example, obviously a US-backed ally in Bahrain. We have the case of this journalist here, who his name is Ahmed Radi, and he was detained for 4 months and released on bail. And he claimed that while he was in jail, that the prosecutors forced him to sign at least 40 confessions as they were fabricating a case against him. Quickly, I'll just go through this. Russia response to the hostage crisis in 2002 enacted very tough anti-terrorism legislation, essentially to prevent reporting on Dagestan and Chechnya. India, we've had a few cases as well of journalists picked up and accused of membership of anti-state groups. Sri Lanka, the same. This journalist, J.S. Tisanayagam, was sentenced to life in prison. He had reported on abuses by the Indian Army in Sri Lanka and was convicted of terrorism. And we have cases in Yemen that were actually mentioned here. And I would like to just leave you with 3 or 4 thoughts to consider as we look at this issue. One is the vague languages, the definitions used by these countries. 2 is the issue of designation of groups as terrorist organizations. There is no international standard for the definition of terrorism, so this is open to interpretation. Also, the issue of best practices. A lot of countries are running into this issue of what are the best practices. I think we should be highlighting those countries that are doing well in terms of implementing anti-terrorism legislation. And finally, the issue of legal challenge, the ability of a journalist dragged in these cases to challenge the constitutionality or even the basis of this anti-terror legislation. There's a lot of work that some groups are doing, but we definitely need a lot more attention to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohammed. That was interesting, disturbing, and Frank and Rachel as well. What's that saying about patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels? Well, since September 11th, terror has been the last refuge, or at least the excuse du jour, decade anyway, of governments around the country. Governments hate to be criticized, whether it's a military despot in the third world or democratically elected governments in the first world. And so they frequently confuse their own political embarrassment with national security. And what we're hearing about many cases is just this being used as an excuse to crack down on dissent. The U.S. is more subtle than a lot of the countries we just heard about. The crackdown doesn't consist of censorship before the fact, as many countries, nor even after the fact punishment in prosecution or violence against journalists, at least not here on U.S. soil for the most part. Instead, the U.S. government chokes off the source of the information to the journalist in the first place. It first does this by classifying documents and information to prevent them from getting into the hands of journalists, prosecuting not the journalists but their sources, and then by manipulation, secondly, propaganda to distract and divert attention from these more disturbing problems. The Bush administration, of course, was in place when 9/11 occurred. There was the groundswell of patriotism. The media was rallying around the flag, anchormen wearing their, patriotic American flags on their lapels, and the kind of voluntary censorship that Frank and Muhammad talked about, choosing not to play the bin Laden tapes because, he might be blinking in a way that sent a signal. The kind of fawning self-coverage of the invasion of Iraq with the embedded reporters cheering on their protectors. The Pentagon secretly paying and training military consultants, veterans, to appear on network television where they were paid as talking head experts and giving the administration line. Outsourcing to the tune of more than $1 billion public relations firms to manipulate the news and news coverage here in the U.S., including fake news videos that the administration produced touting its achievements. And then the leaking of classified information, even while prosecuting whistleblowers for doing that, leaking classified information when it served the administration's ends, from information that proved to be false about non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to leaking the undercover identity of a CIA agent, Valerie Plame, to punish her whistleblower husband. Perhaps more disturbing, the administration to the public, because we need this information. I mean, the media matters only in so much as it's an intermediary to the public. It's really the public that's being deprived of this information, and this information belongs to us. We pay their salaries. This government operates in our name. We are the sovereign, and when they hold this information back from us, they confuse who's really in charge, or who ought to be in charge in a democratic government. So, information was blocked to the public about all the people who were rounded up, mostly of Middle Eastern descent, after 9/11 as either suspects or so-called material witnesses, military investigations and trials at Gitmo, rendition, in essence, the outsourcing of torture to secret prisons around the world, domestic eavesdropping by the National Security Agency on American citizens, and while doing all this, they began prosecuting the whistleblowers who leaked this information that we know about to the news media. We don't know what we don't know, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld. So what other secrets there are, we still await. Some of it can be kind of silly. I had a couple of FBI agents come by my house under the Bush administration. They wanted to seize some dusty old archives for the book I was writing on Jack Anderson, the columnist, who's had battles with the Nixon administration in the 70s, and said there was classified, they suspected there was classified information and that would violate the Espionage Act. So, really kind of carried away here. And unfortunately, President Obama, who campaigned on transparency, under his administration, there have been more prosecutions, criminal prosecutions of whistleblowers than in all other previous administrations combined. The Thomas Drake case we heard about, Jeffrey Sterling, Bradley Manning, and others, and even trying to build a case against the online publisher in Manning's case, Julian Assange. Whatever you think of WikiLeaks and Assange, they were dusting off the Espionage Act to go after him, which is meant for foreign spies, really not for journalistic outlets. Now, to put it all in a little perspective, it's not unique to the present. The U.S. government has clamped down on national security leaks ever since George Washington was president. John Adams signed the Sedition Act and actually jailed editors for criticizing the government. Thomas Jefferson himself was one of the leaks, leaking what today we would consider a classified document. And it does get worse, as discussed, in wartime. During the Civil War, for obvious reasons, the tension between liberty and order, people is going to give way more on the cautious side of order than on liberty in wartime. So Lincoln seized the telegraph lines during the Civil War, censored the war dispatches of reporters. World War I, another Sedition Act under Wilson, led to the jailing and the closing of anti-war newspapers, especially the German-American press. World War II had an actual censorship board which suppressed information from the extent of the damage at Pearl Harbor to the development of the atom bomb. And then since World War II, since the development of the nuclear bomb, we've really lived in a national security state where the number of classified secrets has grown exponentially. The Cold War was justified by the threat of communism. Today, it's the threat of terrorism. There's always an ism there to excuse more secrecy, more clamping down. What's a bit new and different this time is that this war on terror, as it's called, seems to be a war without end that could last for generations. It's hard to imagine an obvious termination, some surrender on a battleship like the Japanese. I don't think so. Collapse like the Berlin Wall, where it's over. Again, we have to wonder how long will these temporary wartime restrictions continue. So it's interesting that, and I've learned some things here today about the crackdown the U.S. has done abroad, which has been more draconian on the journalists who were arrested or charged abroad or targeted. So there's still clearly more safeguards here domestically, but I'm not quite so naive as to think that the U.S. in its foreign policy is really going to act as a moral beacon to the rest of the world, much as I might like that to happen. But it does give a bit of the green light to other governments, more authoritarian governments, to go ahead and do this kind of thing. And we saw the same thing during the Cold War, where in the name of fighting communism, the U.S. turned a blind eye to all kinds of human rights abuses. And what I fear is that the same thing is really happening now, only in the name of anti-terrorism. And whether these allies are Yemen or Israel or whomever, we do a disservice to the ideals we profess to believe in when we ignore that and when we enable that. Thank you.
All right, great. I think those were three excellent presentations. I learned a couple of new things. I guess to start off, because the State Department is not here, the Obama administration is not here, I'm going to try and play devil's advocate and imagine what they might say to kind of explain why they have been so publicly silent on these cases of journalists being jailed under anti-terror laws. I'd imagine they say something like, with our allies, we work on so many diverse national security issues. There's not just counterterrorism, there's anti-piracy, there's drug trafficking, there's working to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, and we just have to consider such a complex array of issues when we decide what to prioritize when we go and talk with our allies bilaterally and multilaterally. And that sometimes we just might decide that this journalist has been imprisoned in Yemen or Eritrea or Ethiopia might not be more important than our national security relationship with that government, and we don't want to offend them and sever that cooperation. So, playing devil's advocate, what would your response to that be?
I'm going to call John Kerry and get you a job. Because you put it well, Rachel. And I think they would also deny the premise. They would say, well, hold on. Of course we speak out about these cases. We speak out about them all the time. And occasionally they do. But what I've found, especially since I've left government and begun to look at our government's actions through a different lens, is that what I find is that the incidence of criticism can be directly correlated to, the poorness of the relationship with the United States. So if you have a country like Iran, with whom the United States has very tough relations at the moment, then you can be absolutely assured that every instance of journalistic repression is going to be chronicled by Ambassador Rice in the UN or by Secretary Clinton or Secretary Kerry. But when you've got a U.S. treaty ally upon whom we're relying, there's a much higher, like Turkey or Bahrain or Yemen or Ethiopia, there's a much greater likelihood that those are going to be overlooked. The question that comes to my mind is not whether the United States or any other country should be expected to treat everyone equally. I think it's an unrealistic expectation. The question I have is whether the silence, the profound silence on these cases, is serving U.S. national security. And I think it's not. I think that if you look at Bahrain in particular as a wonderful case study, I do draw parallels even to the time of the Shah of Iran. And you see a U.S. treaty ally in the Gulf that has a very significant opposition with whom they are contending, and one of the tools they're using are national security laws to lock up bloggers, peace activists, critics, and you're seeing an escalation in the violence, a polarization, an intensification of the divisions within the society, and a reduction in the ability of the society to solve its differences peacefully by implementing the Bassioni report, which was an outside report commissioned partly at the urging of the U.S. government to provide recommendations to the Bahrainis about how to achieve national reconciliation. And the failure of that government to implement the report, the failure of the government to release prisoners of conscience, is inflaming passions and arguably leading to a situation where you may have revolutionary fervor, violence, and insurrection. So is U.S. silence in that case, in deference to the Fifth Fleet, serving U.S. strategic interests, or enabling a government or encouraging a government to stand pat against domestic critics who ought to be listened to, accommodated, and compromised with? So I don't look for fair play from our government. I think, again, it's too much to ask that they would treat everyone equally. And I think that that the officials of the State Department, of the White House, do weigh the importance of these different interests against each other. But in the case of standing up for criticism abroad, they're being short-sighted.
I would absolutely second that. I can speak extensively about Ethiopia, but in that case, you have a government which has systematically criminalized any peaceful means of citizen participation in the country by using this anti-terrorism law and other laws that restrict civil society and basic fundamental rights that citizens have to participate in the political life of the country. And this leads to the formation of reactionary movements, and also strengthens the voices of the more radical voices who are calling for violence. And those voices would call for violence out of desperation of not being able to, peacefully assemble or even peacefully exercise your opinion without being branded as a terrorist. So I understand that it's really stability in the short term, but it's really short-sighted because in the long term it's a pressure cooker and it's not in U.S. interest at all. And it diminishes the standing of the United States abroad. And
which can have impacts on other issues we care about beyond national security, like if we ever want to get another treaty passed,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And lastly, like in the case of Africa or Ethiopia, there is the factor of China, and I understand that the Western powers are feeling the competition of China because Beijing is wooing all the African states right now, and there is this. Some governments are very clever where they actually will bluff to Western diplomats that even if you withhold aid and you you are tough on us, we will just go east and go to Beijing. So, but there is this, I think, misconception in the minds of many diplomats that somehow what China offers African states is equal to or better than what the West offers African government, because in the case of Ethiopia, again, the U.S. gives that country, I believe, $1 billion in assistance, mostly humanitarian assistance, and the EU gives them also the same amount of money. There is no accountability for this money. Nobody really, the Ethiopian government is trusted to utilize this money well and get it to the needy. But there is no transparency. It's a money that's disbursed. On the other hand, the Chinese will not do that. They will not give funds to a state that's especially the record of corruption and opacity. They will do soft loans. They will do construction projects, but they will not, give this amount of money. And many of these governments are seeking prestige in the West, the kind of prestige that they cannot get from Beijing. So there is this misconception in the minds of many diplomats, and they buy this bluff that we can't be too hard on them because they will turn to China.
Right.
And in the case of Ethiopia, they're already turned to China politically, and they're building a one-party state styled after the Chinese Communist Party with U.S. dollars, with U.S. assistance.
It's a very troubling point. Any thoughts on this, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in, and I'm sure there are people who ask questions too. I mean, I would just say that, we tend to often too narrowly define national security. I mean, I understand there's certain global realities, and sometimes we have to hold our noses with some of the governments we have to do business with. So I'm not naive about that, but we can define national security so narrowly and so rigidly that we fail to realize that, as we did, during the Cold War, that communism was not a monolith. Many of the things we perceived as communist movements were actually national liberation movements, and that a lot of what we designate as terrorism isn't necessarily some centralized Al Qaeda, link, and that if we were less rigid and more decent about some of our policies, we would find ourselves on the right side of history instead of the wrong one. You were talking about Iran, and that's a perfect example of how we allied ourselves with the Shah and his regime of torture, and and there are all these other things that constitute national security too. You mentioned treaties. Well, what about global warming? I mean, that may end up killing more people in the end than Al Qaeda, and we need the help of governments everywhere to do that. So, we box ourselves in when we define it too narrowly.
Right. I have one question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience we've got about half an hour of audience Q&A. But one question, right now, we lack an internationally recognized definition of terrorism. There have been talks with the United Nations of having a comprehensive convention on international terrorism, but talks are deadlocked right now over how to define terrorism, and there's debates about whether we distinguish groups who perform what are commonly recognized as terrorist actions, on civilians, versus, what we would more commonly see as liberation movements, and there's a lot of disagreement about that. Do you think a push led by the United States to get this convention moving forward, there has been a lot of forward movement on it in some time, do you think that would go a ways toward getting a principle in place that journalists that are targeted could then use in their court cases to defend themselves against charges that they are colluding with terrorists?
Well, I'm not an attorney, and I don't play one on TV. But I think Amnesty International's view on this is that it's actually a little bit of treacherous ground, because there is an international rule book already in existence about the use of lethal force, and it is well enshrined in international law and international humanitarian law and human rights law. So there's a corpus of legal theory and practice that actually lays out pretty clearly the circumstances under which states can use lethal force. States or other non-state actors can use lethal force. And when we talk about terrorism and who is a terrorist, I mean, we're often talking about essentially the use of lethal force, right? Either against combatants or civilians. And so I think my view is that while it might be useful to try to reinforce the rule book that's already in place, for instance, U.S. drone policy. U.S. drone policy should be brought squarely into compliance with international norms with respect to the use of lethal force. There are definitions of what constitutes an imminent threat against which lethal force can be used, and non-imminent threats against which states are obligated to seek non-lethal means. That attempting to define who is a terrorist and who's a freedom fighter, to define who is fighting for liberty and justice, and who is fighting for tyranny and oppression. I doubt very much that the international community is going to be able to come up with a consensus treaty document that's going to settle that score.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that in a way. I mean, there are baseline standards when these resolutions were passed. The UN Security Council did encourage states to enact these laws within the framework of the existing human rights conventions, including the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. And there are guidelines, legal guidelines about the concept of proportionality, to make sure that these restrictions do not infringe on fundamental rights guaranteed under the Constitution. The problem is that in these countries, it's the judiciary, the institutions are not independent. They're not functioning. They are very much political tools for certain governments, and it becomes extremely difficult to put them to practice when the leadership itself is not interested. And when you have a country like Ethiopia where 99% of the seats in parliament are controlled by one party, they can pass any law they want. There is no accountability, and the judges don't have the independence to rule. And so this is what happens. So I think it's really a call for the countries that are supposed to be leaders that these countries cite, like the Ethiopian government constantly defends its anti-terrorism law by stating that it is an exact copy of the British legislation. But lawyers do agree that it's the British legislation minus all the narrow definitions and civil liberties protections. So it's really a call on to countries like the UK or the US to really set a good example and to really support journalists or individuals who are victims of this, because it breeds resentment. So.
Yeah.
I think you guys said it all.
All right, well, let's turn over to you guys in the front first.
Okay, yeah, I had two questions. One is, I think it was in 1962, the South African government passed an anti-terrorism law that applied to any South African, black or white. You could be picked up off the street and detained for 120 days without access to your lawyer or to your family. Do you feel that kind of law would end up being applied in this country to American citizens? Also, Mark's point about the FBI, I'm assuming they just showed up to your house without any warning, or did they call you and try and see if they could meet you somewhere to do it? Whereas you would have been able to get an attorney and basically control the time and the place of the interrogation or interview.
They did call first, and I was a reporter long enough to know how to handle the FBI, so I didn't feel like I needed my lawyer present. That was just more of an example of the stupidity and futility. They were looking at documents for a dead journalist, and
You didn't have a problem letting them in your home?
nah, I mean, maybe I should have been, but I didn't, and I, politely told them to go piss up a robe. Politely. That was a paraphrase, not a quote. It's an academic term we use.
Any thoughts on the South Africa part?
I don't have any on that, no.
I don't.
It's so tempting to say that such a thing could never happen in the United States. But I think the fundamental question that is before the United States is the boundaries on government action in response to suspected terrorists. It's interesting to me that there's been all this debate in Washington the last couple of weeks about drones and the use of drones to kill those suspected of being engaged in terrorism. The question then becomes, well, all right, it's very, very nice that we're having a debate about execution. What about the much more modest step of detaining for questioning? And presumably the same legal authorities that would enable a U.S. president to sign an execution warrant on a U.S. citizen abroad, logically ought to empower the same U.S. president to sign an order to indefinitely detain and question that U.S. citizen abroad. And it's a paradox that, the live U.S. captive would seemingly have greater habeas corpus rights than the dead American citizen at the end of the Hellfire missile. But I think this is an area of U.S. law that does need elaboration, clarification, transparency from the Justice Department, because it's not clear to me on the face of it why it would be illegal to indefinitely detain if it is in fact legal to kill.
That's a very good point.
So the question I have deals a little bit with taking kind of responsibility for one's actions. And the way I'd like to frame the question is, when you touched on Private Manning earlier, if you were to look at a case where Private Manning working from the inside and bound by certain disclosures, oaths, agreements, however you'd like to frame it, as opposed to a journalist, say, in Ethiopia, Eritrea, or Somalia, who's working from outside the system and trying to gain some kind of transparency while working under somewhat arbitrary, nebulous, I believe the term was used, anti-terror laws. Where is the line of responsibility drawn between these two approaches? Is there a responsibility that Private Manning should, accept for some of his actions? I'm just curious what the panel would have to say about those two approaches to the subject.
I guess I'd say yes to that, and I think he did just plead guilty, whether that was because of embracing his responsibility or the government's case was so ironclad that it's part of trying to cop a better plea. I don't know. When Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, he was viewed it as an act of civil disobedience for which he was prepared to go to prison for the rest of his life. And had it not been for the Nixon administration's dirty tricks that obstructed justice, that might well have happened. And ironically, of course, that set in motion the chain of events that would topple Nixon. So you're right. It's a fair distinction. And I don't mean to draw equivalency. My point in bringing that up in context was that in the U.S., the authorities, the government is more careful going after the journalists themselves. Instead, they target the sources. Whereas abroad, often it's more crude and they go directly after the journalists themselves. But that both approaches do lead to choke or can lead to choking off information to the public.
Well, I'll just quickly mention the case of the two Swedish reporters who were imprisoned in Ethiopia. They did admit and plead guilty to entering the country illegally. They were embedding with the rebels that entered the country from Somalia. And the Ethiopian government has the perfect authority and responsibility to prosecute them for entering the country illegally. It's a calculated risk that they took, and they were caught. Now, we don't dispute that. Now, the only problem we have is when they attempt to add to that a more serious charge of supporting terrorism for embedding, and there is no evidence, convincing evidence that they presented to back up that charge. Instead, what we saw were, what one of the reporters called a mockumentary, where they forced these journalists to enact these scenes, to reenact their arrest, and to as footage to give the prosecutor to make the case, where they were actually trying to make the case or fabricate evidence to make the case. And it was particularly ironic coming from this government in power in Ethiopia, because they were themselves once freedom fighters and rebels who fought for 18 years against a despotic regime. And at that time, they were welcoming reporters like the Swedes to tell their story to the world. And for them to turn around today and criminalize that kind of activity, news gathering activity, as terrorism is totally pathetic.
I've nothing to add. I recently, as I mentioned, I was in Vietnam, and it was so interesting to me to see the way that country is in some ways opening up, and in other ways is going through a discussion right now about human rights. And I had a chance to visit an art museum in Ho Chi Minh City, in Saigon, and I was struck by the fact that there was artwork there done by battlefield artists who traveled with the Viet Minh, right, to essentially chronicle their struggle against the French and then later against the United States. And I was thinking to myself, would these chroniclers, would these artists who painted and depicted the struggle of the Viet Minh, and often painted it in heroic terms, would they be terrorists under today's standards for aiding and abetting through their artwork, chronicling the struggle? Would they be, as embedded reporters in that struggle, subject to criminal penalty in today's environment for their art? I mean, I think we are at a point where we need to think about the difference between those chronicling and reporting and attempting to help the world understand the conflicts that are broadly part of this global war on terrorism that the United States has declared, and those who are engaged in it as combatants. And there has to be a difference, but that line has become extraordinarily blurry when you start locking up chroniclers or reporters or journalists or artists who are documenting the world around them and using national security laws to accuse them of being engaged in that armed struggle.
And I would just add one thing on the Bradley Manning issue. I think Bradley Manning, like any U.S. citizen who decides to undertake an act of civil disobedience, really should be thinking about what price am I willing to pay for this act that I care about. But I think the United States government also needs to be thinking about optics. There hasn't yet been really a full public accounting of the WMD intelligence fiasco that got us into the Iraq War. And, we have not yet had really anybody involved in the Wall Street Wall Street shenanigans really has had to come to trial yet. So I think optics are an issue here when we're talking about reputation and what the U.S. government decides to throw the full weight of itself behind, that these things all should, it might be a good idea to consider them together. Who else?
This is two questions, but they're sort of a lie. The first is, given that you can't, or we aren't, quote, defining terrorism, unquote, for various reasons, which have been spelled out very well, what can journalists do to protect themselves? And the second is, let's flip it around. Even if you do, quote, define terrorism with a piece of paper of some type or another, how do you get the non-state actors, for lack of a better term, to follow the piece of paper? And say, okay, I'm not a terrorist, or okay, I am. Not that they're going to say that, but you get the idea.
When you have the answer, let us know.
Well, let's do number one first, because what measures can journalists take? Give them this amorphousness to protect themselves.
Unfortunately, a lot of these laws have a chilling effect on reporting, and it's a red line, because these cases, as well for governments, when they do this, it's also to set an example, to intimidate and scare everybody else. And when this happens to these two Swedish reporters, now, international journalists are less likely to want to go investigate the story or take the risk. Or in a country like Ethiopia, the coverage of security issues or even mild criticism of the party is now, most journalists have left the country because of that.
I was reading your report here beforehand. Mexico is a walking disaster without self-censorship, and not because of the laws, but because of the cartels.
Right, self-censorship.
So to finish the answer to the question, the other two, do you want to jump in?
I don't have an answer for you.
Yeah, I think the solution is really to build robust, independent institutions, governance, good leadership in these countries, because that's the key, really. Because even in a country like Zimbabwe, where as repressive as Zimbabwe is, the institutions are still quite strong and functioning. And at the lower level, with the lower courts, journalists who get in prison or prosecutors still get acquitted. The judge will actually follow the law, and if the police doesn't have evidence, he will dismiss the case. When you go to higher courts and it's a political, high-profile case, that's not going to be the case. But the civil service is still strong and functioning. So I think that's really the solution.
I agree with Mohammed, and I'm trying to recall, and maybe someone in the room recalls, but Senator Chris Dodd a few years ago was working on legislation, trying to establish stronger international protections for journalists. And again, it was in response not just to the arrest of journalists, but to the killing of journalists abroad. I mean, we should remember that this is not just about intimidation and detention, but you have cases like Anna Politkovskaya in Russia, who are executed for their questioning of authority and their criticism of authority. And so I think there may be a role for the U.S. government in trying to propagate a norm of greater protection for journalists internationally. And I need to revisit whatever happened to that Dodd idea. I think it was a good idea at the time.
Sorry, I don't have an answer for you.
Over here.
I just have a question to the panel, because I believe all of you mentioned China in one way or another. My question is regarding Taiwan, the relationship between China and Taiwan and how that impacts the international community. We often set a precedence that, like, the U.S. should obey international law when it comes to, let's say, warfare, treaties, and things like that. When an international organization like the United Nations refuses to recognize that, I wouldn't go as far to call
what's your question for the
My
panel?
question regards, the whole thing with journalism and how like the press is now free in Taiwan versus in China. You have dissidents like Chen Guangjiang, like he still gets captured and put away and isn't allowed to express his voice freely, and just the double standard there in terms of like having to subvert yourself to the international law and the governing resolutions of the United Nations when such a body doesn't recognize democracy and recognizes.
Well, you're not going to like the answer, but that's what I meant by there are certain geopolitical realities, and when we owe as much money to Taiwan as we do to the People's Republic, and when Taiwan's military and nuclear capabilities match those of the PRC, then I suspect the ethical impulse will follow.
There's no doubt in my mind that press freedoms are stronger in Taiwan than in China. They're imperfect in both places, but they're much stronger in Taiwan, where you have a robust debate in the press and independent newspapers and radios, and journalists are able to publish criticisms of the leadership and the ruling party. I don't know what, the other part of your question, I don't have an opinion on in terms of what that ought to lead the U.S. government to do with respect to how we treat Taiwan and China. I think one is clearly more in the friend category than the other, and the relationship with Taiwan is exceptionally close, and the relationship with China is impeded by many things, and one of the principal obstacles to a closer relationship is China's human rights record.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Julie Rashadi. I'm curious, so it was said on the panel that the U.S. is willing to pressure countries with which we have poor diplomatic relations, such as in Iran was an example given. But still looking at the actual circumstances and the reality of what's going on, the Iranian government has not relented in any way towards dissidents or journalists, and the only situations in which they do that I can recall really involve a lot more kind of like crowdsourced, groundswell, grassroots, like Amnesty International, non-governmental interventions. So I kind of want maybe a little more elaboration on, or maybe a defense of the idea that governments talking to each other actually really gets anything done at all. Especially with the lack of the U.S.'s accountability in the first place, like we were talking about.
Let me take a first cut at this, but then I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel on it as well. Look, for 9 years I worked at the State Department, and then for 14 years at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And for all that time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I undertook a lot of sort of track to human rights diplomacy. So I would travel to Tibet, or I'd go to China, or I'd go to southern Thailand, where there's a Islamic separatist insurgency, or Mindanao, and I would work quietly on human rights issues. And I can tell you that whether at the State Department or on Capitol Hill, engagement can make a difference in the practices of governments abroad on human rights. I got people out of prison in China, Tibetan nuns and others. I got investigations started in Indonesia or in Mindanao that might otherwise have languished, investigations into human rights abuses that were perpetrated by the armed forces or by the police. And I did it not because of who I was, but because of who I represented, right? If you're there working on behalf of the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden, or if you're there on behalf of Secretary Jim Baker, guess what? There was a day when people took that pretty seriously, and where U.S. moral authority and U.S. moral suasion could make a difference. I had a go-to person in Beijing for many years. I won't name him because he's still in Chinese government. And I could go to him and we would meet one-on-one very quietly in a tea house that I knew. And I would hand him a list. I said, here are the people that my boss is most concerned about right now, and we want 3 names off that list out of prison, and he would deliver. Because the U.S. government, this is all pre-9/11, because the U.S. government had a certain persuasive power. So it matters. I mean, it can help, but just kind of lobbing your criticisms over the fence at the embassy, or blasting them out in the media, by itself, that's not going to do a whole heck of a lot. Now, I work for Amnesty International. Part of what we do is to shine a spotlight on injustice, but we do it with a certain methodology. We look for cases that are emblematic of systemic problems, and then we try to mobilize coalitions for change. And we try to work with civil society both in those countries and abroad to bring about the right constellation of forces to help bring about systemic change. And I think there's room in the world for that kind of activism too. And I think especially in the age of the internet, in the age of super empowered individuals, we shouldn't sell ourselves short in terms of our ability to affect change. But I'm still a believer in the ability of governments to persuade other governments to change their behavior through engagement.
I'm curious what you gave in exchange for the release of the Chinese dissidents, or what you offered.
There was no explicit quid pro quo, but in essence, the Chinese understood that there was either going to be progress both on individual cases and systemic advances, or there was going to be a black eye for China in the international reputation and media and the press. And Senator Biden used to tell me, he said, the hardest thing about being a senator was not deciding, what was important. The hardest thing about being a senator was what really important thing he wasn't going to do that day. Same thing goes for engagement of the U.S. government in the public space, right? It's easy to take a shot at a country like China on human rights. You don't have to do it on any given day, right? You make choices every day in the U.S. government about when to raise an issue to a certain level. And making a choice that that's not the day you're going to do it because you believe that your quiet pressure is going to extract movement on your objective, that's a choice that U.S. government officials make every day.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it depends on the country again. I mean, obviously, there are countries where there is no hope of movement with, countries like Eritrea, or places like Zimbabwe, where the U.S. doesn't really have a lot of influence. But in the long run, even this combination of quiet diplomacy, sustained engagement, and public pressure does make a difference. And in the cases of journalists in prison, it guarantees them better treatment in jail because there's a measure of accountability that the government has. And in places like Africa, it means a whole lot. It's a really big deal if the U.S. ambassador is involved or even attends a court hearing. It does make a big difference. So.
U.S. ambassador to Cambodia, after a December, sort of the Cambodian version of the December massacre. So this was not a massacre, but the widespread arrest of human rights activists back, I want to say it was like 2009, but don't quote me. U.S. ambassador went to the house where the dissident was being arrested, was there as they were marched out of their house, went to the trial. Those guys got released. I mean, Hun Sen backed down. I know that there's a temptation in Washington. The inside the Beltway mentality is that the U.S. influence maybe is on the wane. It grows with every mile from Washington D.C. Right? And in a place like Cambodia, you know, the words of the U.S. ambassador still matter a lot, you know? And one of the great frustrations I have at Amnesty International, witnessing behavior by my government, which I think does not uphold, you know, the best practices, is that I see that influence diminished. You know, it became harder for me when I was in the Senate to get people out of jail or even to get a amelioration of their circumstances when the United States began to hold people without charge indefinitely in Guantanamo Bay. You know, and I would go to my go-to guy in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and I'd say, "Hey, Lao Pengyo, you know, let's talk human rights today." And he's like, "Bu keneng, bu fangbian." It's not convenient. I don't think so. Not right now. Like, why? Well, you know, my government's not very intimidated by your government right now when it comes to human rights. We don't think you're really in a very strong position to criticize us. So take a hike. Go piss up a rope. Yeah.
I think that was a very, very interesting comment you just said. We have time for one more comment before we're going to wrap this up. Anybody have a question? Quick one?
A quick sort of follow-up question on that issue, and it sort of relates to whether or not, because we're talking about the U.S. involvement and specifically a number of the countries that have been mentioned are close allies when it comes to counterterrorism measures. Do the levers of power and influence change because when we're interacting with these countries because we're talking about counterterrorism? So, for example, one might be with the State Department and hear quite strenuously from somebody within the department that handles democracy, rights, and labor that they include it in their reports and that they raise it in their meetings. But is that as effective when there's also a counterterrorism relationship between those two governments? Is the message not being conveyed? Because it seems like those people, at least from my perspective, have been absent from those meetings.
Well, look, it's a very good question. You know, does the U.S. government speak with one voice? Rarely. You know, occasionally it does. Sometimes some of the strongest voices for human rights abroad may surprise you. It's not always the State Department, DRL, Bureau folks who are necessarily the most vociferous or the most effective advocates for human rights, as pure as their hearts may be. And on occasion, the U.S. Army sergeant training the Special Forces unit in Cambodia may be a more effective advocate for respect for human rights and due process and restraint on the use of force and rules of engagement than would be a civilian. You know, it's possible, and I don't want to impugn, you know, any one part of the U.S. government and say, oh, those guys are incapable of advancing human rights norms, because I've seen good examples of both. You know, I've been with U.S. Special Forces in Zamboanga who were doing a good job trying to inculcate human rights norms in the Armed Forces Philippines units that they were training. And I've been with State Department officers in other environments in southern Thailand trying to counteract bad U.S. military propaganda that had led the Thai Special Forces to believe that they could act with impunity. You know, so, you know, for sure the U.S. government ought to, across the board, speak with one voice when it comes to human rights norms. We don't always, but we have some effective, the U.S. government, I don't work there anymore, the U.S. government has some effective champions. I wish there were more of them. Yeah.
No comment.
Well, I think then that wraps it up. I think this has been a really fruitful and illuminating discussion for me personally. I guess I would just sum it up with this one thought that as the U.S. government pursues its national security interests all over the world, there's one thing that I think the last 100 years of people's movements we've seen in South America, the former Soviet Union, and now in the Arab world is that, you know, the public's desire for human rights, a voice in their government is irrepressible. And when we are on the side of the line, on the side that favors short-term goals, we run the risk of being, you know, on the wrong side of pro-democracy movements that we have seen ultimately tend to come about. That's what we've seen in the course of the last century. So thank you everybody for coming here. Again, we've got a great week of sunshine events planned here at the Press Club. I just want to, again, you know, push our Friday lunch with a whistleblower. It's going to be a great event. You can get your tickets online. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.